Greetings great guys, and welcome back to What If Goku Was an Avatar? This is part 2. Right, so a brief summary of what happened in the last part. Goku, or I should really have said Kakarot from the start, since that was what his name was on planet Vegeta before the crash landing. So Kakarot was slingshot into a wormhole due to the sun collapsing into a black hole. After he crash landed on Earth in the Avatar universe that is, he was found by the villagers of the Southern Water Tribe. He became part of Sokka and Katara's family, and was present during the Southern Raiders' attack, led by John Ra, or John Ra, I still don't know what he's called. The three siblings lost their mother, and as an effect, took their training more seriously once the pain had begun to ease. This training resulted in all three of them being about 2 years better than their original counterparts. Toku, as they decided to call him, had just learnt his own version of firebending, in the form of a fiery energy beam. As impressive and bizarre and scary as this was for the villagers, it gave them a weird sense of hope. Gran had stated in the last part how she believed that boy, Toku, may be the Avatar. So, let's pick the pieces up and continue this puzzle. The villagers looked at each other, then at Toku, then back at one another. Could this really be true? A war had been going on for 100 years, without a single sight of the Avatar, just for this backwater village to suddenly run into him a few years ago, almost delivered like a baby on the doorstep. What were the odds? And if he truly were the Avatar, why had he been without bending for so long? And why would fire be the first element he displayed? Why not water? There were so many questions and doubts around the campfire that night. But at the same time, they all thought it made perfect sense. It would explain the firebending, as well as the Great Ape transformation he scared them all with a few years back. Yeah, he must have somehow subconsciously made contact with the Spirit Realm, being the Great Bridge and all. Toku was just as confused as the rest of them. He didn't know anything about being the Avatar. He supposed it was possible, stating he didn't know what being the Avatar was supposed to feel like. By the way, this version of Kakarot isn't super smart or anything, as he still hit his head, and well, I don't know, maybe Kakarot wasn't super smart to begin with. But he wasn't really dumb either. Toku here has grown up with the village, and was at least more civilized than the original. Just thought I should mention that. Hakoda, being the father, as well as some of the elders, tried to think about what next to do with this possible new revelation. I know most other nations have their ways of finding out who the Avatar is, but something tells me that this particular village has lived under a rock, disconnected from the outside world for many years, and therefore lost this kind of knowledge, especially since they are so few in number. Survival skills being passed down would probably have been more of a priority than figuring out who the Avatar was, especially when he or she had been gone for 100 years. So anyway, Hakoda and the others would start to wander as the children went to bed later. The next morning, Hakoda, as well as the same elders, approached Toku and asked him if he'd be up for some testing, just to try and see if they could figure it out. Toku of course agreed, and they got to work. They weren't quite sure how to go about it, but figured it'd be best if they just let him test bending other elements, at least to start with. Toku tried for quite some time, but to no avail. Here, Toku is only 10 years old and doesn't have telekinesis yet, nor does he have an understanding, or at least not a great understanding, for ki control in general. So to produce, well, fake, I guess, water, air, / earthbending, it was out of the question, at least for now. Katara was soon asked to get involved and just to kind of try and explain what she does when she waterbends, but this too proved pretty useless. She was explaining it in a waterbender way that perhaps would make sense to someone who actually bends, or at least waterbends. But Toku, he would need a ki control expert like Kami or Kinkai, someone who could teach him the advanced stuff, or simply learn it by himself from years of figuring it out. So after a week of nothing, they decided to drop it, at least for the time being. There were more pressing matters at hand, such as aiding others in the war against the Fire Nation. So just like that, the time had come for Koda and the rest of the men of the village to leave. So we still get that scene where Sokka runs after his dad, wanting to join them. He hadn't brought his younger siblings with him for this request, however, despite knowing that they were probably more powerful than him. This is because Sokka still has this responsibility, be the older brother, be a man type of attitude, not wanting to bring his younger siblings into war. But as we all know, Hakoda tells him that being a man is about knowing where you're needed the most, and so leaves him to take care of the village. Also because he doesn't want his child to die in war, knowing he's not old enough or strong enough yet. Things were kind of gloomy for a while after the men had left. The villagers were of course worried for their safety. Sure, they understood, but nobody likes war. After some time though, life went back to normal, for most of them at least. Sokka became more of a leader, much like how he became leader and man of the village in the original. Although Toku never tried joining the men to war, like Sokka did, he was still a bit bummed out about having to stay in the village. He was strong, he could help, but after Sokka told him what their dad told him, he knew there was no point in trying. Instead, both of them, together with Katara, became the new fake adults over the next couple of years. They often went out hunting and fishing for the village, as well as helping out at camp, just raising and looking after the younger kids. You know, Sokka and his mini army of 5-year-olds. One day, the three siblings were out on a fishing trip in a wooden canoe, and I think you know which day this is. And before you say anything, no, I didn't make them all go out fishing on the exact same day Katara and Sokka found Aang in the original, just for the convenience sake. Now, this particular fishing trip could have been any day. Aang's just been there all along, waiting. He's not going anywhere, so this could have been weeks before or weeks after. Eventually they would have come across him. Anyway, Katara was practicing her bending, trying to catch not one, but 2 fish in a bubble, which she could do with ease this time because she was better at bending. And Toku was fishing with his tail at the back of the canoe. Sokka was in the middle with his spear, bragging about how he was going to catch for sure this time. Here's a change though. Katara, being a bit better at bending, didn't lose control over the bubble when Sokka accidentally stabbed it with the spear, and so they got to keep both of the fish plus the one Sokka caught. Great! Thanks to this, Katara and Sokka never began to argue, and therefore never lost control over the boats. But something else got the boat moving. Toku had had enough of this one fish teasing him, and so decided to turn things up a notch. He used his flame beam and straight into the water, taking care of the fish, but also acting as an outboarder for the canoe. This attack caused all 3 of the siblings to go flying down the stream, boat and all, crash landing, somewhere above the frozen globe Aang had forged a century ago.
Ah, Toku, what we said about firebending inside the boat. Oops, sorry guys, I guess we just got a little carried away. But at least the boat's still intact. Sort of.
Is that why it's sinking? Sokka said in a sarcastic tone, but then quickly changed his attitude to a more freaked out, voice cracking,
"Oh, it's sinking! And the fish as well!"
"Calm down, Sokka," said Katara, as she began using her water bending to freeze ice patches onto the canoe where the holes used to be. But he's right, Toku. You can't just blast away like that. These patches won't hold for long, not with us moving inside the boat. Katara may not have been as dramatic as Sokka in this situation, but she didn't look forward to explaining to Gran later why yet another boat had holes in it. But Toku, being Toku, wasn't really listening to what his sister was saying. His attention was elsewhere. More specifically, below the surface. There seemed to be something glowing down there. Something big.
"Hey guys," he announced. "There's something down there."
The 2 of them forgot all about the boat for a moment and joined Toku by the edge on the other side of the ice raft. None of them had a clue as to what that big glowing thing below the surface might have been. But Toku, being Toku, stood up, started getting undressed and said,
"I'll go check it out."
Sokka and Katara were used to Toku's slight wild craziness, but this stunt was on a whole other level.
"What? You crazy, Toku? Water's freezing. We'll turn into a block of ice." "Nah, I'll be fine. Just make sure my clothes don't blow away,"
he said as he jumped. Katara and Sokka just stared at one another, as if to say, "Yep, this takes the cake." But before they even had a chance to worry, Toku came shooting up through the water, his limbs shaking all over the place from the cold. He then landed beside his siblings.
"It's kinda cold down there,"
he said through chattering teeth. "I'm not surprised. What were you thinking?" said Katara, as she wrapped her coat around him. "So, did you see anything?"
"Yeah, there's someone down there, Sokka. We should help them."
The 2 older siblings looked at each other, a bit confused. Toku, you sure your eyes weren't playing tricks on you down there? It was pretty cold." "Katara's right, Toku. No one could have survived down there. Which means, if you saw someone, they're already dead."
"No, you guys, his eyes were glowing."
"How did you know it's a he?"
"Well, he didn't seem to have any hair at least." "What do you know? Maybe it's an old man. In that case, we should definitely help him out."
"So, Toku took aim and shot his flame beam down towards the edge of the iceberg, nudging it slightly. And yes, his fire could travel through the water because it's not just fire, it's a kind of energy beam, and so I'd allow it. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then the iceberg seemed to get bigger and bigger. No, it was getting closer and closer. Quickly, all three of them got out the way, and shortly after that, the ice globe emerged where they were all standing just a few seconds ago. Of course, now having seen through the ice the shape of a bald person with glowing eyes for themselves, they had no choice but to believe what the younger brother said.
See, I told you!
He needs our help, said Katara. She raised her hands and attempted to melt a hole through the ice, but it didn't work. I think due to Aang being in the Avatar state, not quite aware of what was going on, Katara's melting the ice bending was basically battling Aang's Avatar state that was keeping the globe frozen. So here, she would of course be sort of outbended. They'd need a different way of getting the old man, who now looked more like a young boy, out of the ice. This is where Sokka stepped in. I know he was very cautious in the original, being the older, responsible brother, but here, all three of them were stronger, slightly more confident, and Sokka was also more humble and accepting towards helping strangers he didn't know. I mean, his younger brother was basically found in the ice, so he'd be slightly more used to these sort of things. Also, his little brother was the one to dive down and ensure this whole thing happened, and then his sister took the first crack at trying to get him out. He was the oldest of them, for crying out loud. He had to do something. He pulled out his trusty weird-looking weapon that isn't a boomerang but still kind of looks like one, and got whacking away. Everything then happened as it did in the original, with a light going to the sky, alerting Zuko, and Aang passing out just to wake up a few seconds later in Katara's arms. Toku was the first of them to speak, before Aang even had a chance to be like, "Hey, come a little closer. Penguin!" Yeah. Anyway, he complimented Aang, stating how that was so cool and he must be a super strong waterbender for having created such a massive ball of ice. Katara joined in, agreeing with Toku, explaining that she could feel the resistance when she tried melting the ice. Sokka was still kind of lost for words and was only able to mutter, "You okay?" Aang got up with a smile, looked at them and replied, "I'm not a waterbender, I'm an airbender." This would leave even Toku confused. Once again, he was no genius, but if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that airbenders were extinct. Sokka then found his voice and took a more skeptical tone, stating that that was impossible, and how nobody had seen an airbender in a very long time. Aang was still smiling and said that that wasn't so weird, considering you needed to be able to fly through the sky to get to one of the air temples. This didn't convince Sokka, and he went ahead to say his classical, "Last time I checked, humans can't fly," to which Aang would respond, "Check again," and with a smirk on his face, he made a few loops through the air with his glider, and then pulled out his famous party trick, one with the stones and weird smile. Yep, this proved it. He was an airbender alright. Somehow. But the three didn't get a chance to question him any further. At least not for now, as Aang would remember his big body upper and run towards him. It's not like the others hadn't noticed him in the background, but it just kind of bypassed their minds due to the fact that there was a flying boy with arrows on his head flying, or airbending, right in front of them. But when they finally did process the bison, Sokka's mouth dropped to the floor. What was that monster? The monster was introduced to the siblings as Appa, and was apparently his flying bison. Katara and Toku were then introduced to Aang by Sokka as Katara and Toku, his flying siblings. After the introductions, they realised that the iceberg popping up, as well as Toku's fire blast, had pushed the canoe away and kind of smashed it into pieces a bit more, but this wasn't an issue, as Aang would then offer them all a ride back on Appa. Sokka may be a bit brave in this what if, but this idea still made him a bit uncomfortable. He did get on board the bison in the end though. And that will be it for this part. See you in part 3 if you want a part 3, that is. Also, I have a question for you viewers out there, just so I know for future videos that I make. How many of you look at the screen while listening to my story? Because I spend quite a lot of time making the actual pictures and stuff, and I just want to know if they get looked at. But if it's more of a story thing where you kind of walk away from the screen, I think maybe I'll spend just slightly less time on editing the photos, because that takes quite a long time. Anyway, thanks for watching.